So clearly, right, this is a thing in our black community, right, our black household, these creative coping skills. And while some of them may help, like prayer, or we might need to take a nap to reset, this isn't the end all be all to really effectively addressing our mental health. Okay? So, exercise. Okay. So, we'll move on to the next slide. Thank you. Still up. Oh, here. Okay. So then that brings us to our next point. What is mental health? So there's a difference between mental health and mental illness. So mental health, just like physical health, everybody in this room has physical health and everybody in this room has mental health. So mental health refers to our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we handle stress, day-to-day life, how we relate to other people, and how we make our choices. So good mental health is the foundation for what overall well-being and being resilient and overcoming our obstacles. So then the difference between mental health and mental illness is mental illness is the actual condition or psychiatric disorder. So it is a disorder that affects a person's ability to function over time. It also refers to a wide range of conditions that we'll get through in the next slide. But it affects the person's thoughts, their emotions, their behavior, and their overall functioning. So it deeply impacts their day-to-day living. And it also may impact their ability to relate to others. So this is a list of some common mental health disorders that you may or may not be familiar with. So depression is a number one common mental illness. So it's characterized by persistent feelings of sadness, hopelessness, a lack of interest in things that you used to do. Physical symptoms can manifest as being fatigued or tired. You might have trouble sleeping, and then changes in your appetite. Some common anxiety symptoms might include excessive worry or fear, excessive nervousness. Sometimes you might feel physical sensations like palpitations or your heart racing, sweating or trembling. So anxiety is a big one. I think a lot of people don't acknowledge or may not be able to understand that it's anxiety because it's a physical sensation a lot of times that you're feeling, and you might not know to coin it as anxiety. Bipolar disorder involves extreme mood swings between depressive episodes, manic episodes. So oftentimes you'll see individuals who have highs and lows. Their mood changes very rapidly. They might engage in impulsive behaviors such as excessive spending. They might go on, and episodes can last for a couple weeks, so they might not be sleeping for days and just really engaging in some risky behavior. And then OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, is characterized by recurring unwanted thoughts. So these are the obsessions, and then repetitive behaviors are compulsions. So sometimes you're performing behaviors to reduce that anxiety you think in your mind. So one example would be you got to touch the light switch 6 times before you cut it off and leave the room. And this is a real thing, and people really do struggle with these things. And then you got PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a big one. And this develops after exposure to a traumatic event. So some symptoms might include flashbacks of that event, nightmares, severe anxiety, and uncontrollable thoughts about that event. And then you have schizophrenia, which is a severe mental health disorder that's characterized with distorted thinking. So the person is out of touch with reality. They might be hallucinating. So there are different ways a person can hallucinate. So it might be auditory. They're hearing things that other people are saying they cannot hear. They might be having visual hallucinations. So they're seeing things that other people say they can't see. or they might have tactile hallucinations, and that is feeling sensation. So they might feel like bugs are crawling all over their skin when clearly we don't see bugs crawling on their skin. And then they also might have some delusions. They might have be preoccupied with religious delusions even. So they might think that they are Jesus, or that their loved one is, or somebody is Satan in this room, and they really believe that when they are experiencing these psychotic episodes. Eating disorders, so these might include anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating, or just having an unhealthy relationship with food, your body image, and your weight. And then borderline personality disorder, and that involves unstable moods or behaviors. It really impacts your relationships with other people. You might often have intense episodes of anger, depression, and or anxiety. But these disorders can vary in their severity and their impact on your life. So these disorders show up differently in everyone. So not everyone, but it shows up differently in different people. Okay? And it's also important to note that genetics and environment plays a significant role or influence in whether a person develops a mental illness. So some people, unfortunately, are predisposed genetically to certain disorders. So disorders like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, you typically see that in some part of your lineage or in your history, your family history, that someone had these type of disorders. And there are certain things like drugs that can also manifest a disorder like schizophrenia. Okay, so some people will engage in certain drug use that will kind of bring this out, and then they will have that mental illness or condition. So there are some common warning signs of a mental illness. And remember, the difference between mental health and mental illness is everybody in this room, all of us have mental health, just like our physical health. The mental illness is the condition or disorder. So some common warning signs are feeling very sad or withdrawn for more than 2 weeks, trying to harm yourself or take your life, severe out of control or risky behavior that causes harm to yourself or to others, a sudden overwhelming sensation of fear for no reason, sometimes with a racing heartbeat, difficulty to breathe or hyperventilation, significant changes in your weight, seeing or hearing things like the hallucinations like I mentioned on the previous slide, excessive use of drugs and alcohol. I think this is a big one in our community, is that we often associate or we write off our drunk Uncle Johnny as just the drunk of the family, but in reality, Uncle Johnny is dealing with some mental health issues. And we have to be more cognizant of that and not just write these symptoms off. And a lot of times we're masking things or self-medicating to numb ourselves from our traumatic past and different pains of our life by using drugs and alcohol to numb that. And then drastic changes in mood, personality, sleeping habits, extreme trouble concentrating or focusing or staying still, and then intense worries or fears that get in the way of our day-to-day life. And then again, these warning signs manifest different in different people. It can be a combination thereof, but these are just some things to kind of be aware of and look out for. And then again, there are some coexisting conditions that kind of occur at the same time as a mental illness. So risk of suicide. Having a mental illness puts us at a higher risk of suicide than a person who doesn't have a mental illness. It puts us at a greater risk for self-harming behaviors, for having sleep disorders, and then again, using substances and alcohol to medicate ourselves. I wanted to take a moment to talk about the silent suffering that so many of our people endure with grief and trauma. So I put a picture of the shirt and the lanyard because I want you guys to know the difference between commemorating or honoring a loved one, and processing grief. So when I say processing grief, that doesn't mean there's an end to it, right? Because grief is a lifelong process. It can be for many people. But to process grief, it just simply means to acknowledge the grief, to address the grief. And many of us will get a shirt or a lanyard and not talk about how we really feel about losing that loved person, right? So we're honoring and we're keeping their memory alive, but we're not really addressing how we feel inside about that person no longer being here with us, okay? So there's a cultural expectation of being strong, and what that leads to is us suppressing that grief. So we don't talk about our emotions, and we internalize grief and trauma because we're expected to just be strong, right? Sometimes we have that expectation on ourselves, and sometimes people have that expectation for us to just be strong. It leads to emotional numbness. We don't trust people or systems. We don't cope in a healthy way. Again, we might turn to unhealthy coping skills. And it's not just drugs. We might turn to unhealthy activities like intercourse. Just a lot of just unhealthy coping skills. And then it leads to stress on our body. So when we're not processing trauma and grief, it leads to stress on the body. So sometimes you're wondering, why am I having these headaches? Why is my chest hurting? And many times it's not related to an actual, your chest is not hurting because you're having a heart attack. Your chest is hurting because you have some significant anxiety, and anxiety is causing those chest pains. So we just need to pay attention to our bodies as well, and just make sure that we're processing or addressing our grief. And then the cycles of unprocessed grief and trauma in the Black communities often involves emotional pain that are passed down through generations. So we don't know that everybody in this room, you might have inherited some of your grief and trauma from the previous generation, and now you might also be passing down this trauma and grief to your offspring. So we just also need to be cognizant of that as well.